Okay, so ready to dive in. Today we're tackling a giant, Aristotle.
Giant is right. I mean, born all the way back in 384 BCE.
Yeah, and we're not just talking some obscure name from a textbook, right? This guy studied with Plato.
Oh, yeah, Plato and, tutored Alexander the Great. Like, come on, that's pretty impressive.
Then goes and founds his own school, the Lyceum, right there in Athens.
Dies in 322, but leaves this just massive amount of work.
I mean, we're talking science, ethic, and politics. It's kind of crazy how much he covered.
And here's the thing. When we dive into Aristotle, it's not like reading these perfectly published books.
Yeah, it's more like raw lecture notes, right?
Yeah, maybe even who else stuff his students jotted down during class.
But still, in this collection, 31 works, we call it the Corpus Aristotelicum. There's such systematic thought in there.
It's like a window right into this, incredible mind just working through stuff.
So imagine him trying to, categorize all knowledge, right? He basically invents our academic subjects.
He comes up with these three main kinds of quote-unquote sciences. You've got your theoretical sciences.
Like physics, metaphysics. So basically knowledge just for the sake of knowing.
Right. Then there's the practicals. This is where he gets into ethics, politics, how to live a good life.
How to create a good society, right? The stuff that really affects us on a day-to-day basis.
Then the productive sciences, like rhetoric, poetics. This is about creating things, useful or beautiful things.
Which is so interesting because when we think of rhetoric, we think, oh, persuasive speaking, right? But for him, there's this whole science to it.
It's got its own methods, its own principles, And we can't forget his organon. That's all about logic, argumentation.
The name itself means tool.
Yeah, literally. It's the toolbox for thinking properly, categorizing things, building explanations, all of that.
So it's like he created the guidebook on how to think clearly, make solid arguments. But to really get Aristotle, you kind of got to compare him to his teacher, Plato, right?
Oh, yeah, that's key. So Plato, building on Socrates, was all about definitions. What is courage? What is justice? That whole thing.
And from that comes the theory of forms.
Right. So think about it. The world we see, the physical world, it's like a shadow.
And the true reality.
That's in these perfect, eternal forms. Things like justice, beauty, with a capital B.
And you can only access these forms through intellect. Kind of like what we saw in that Sedley video and that piece from Parmenides.
Yeah, exactly. Socrates kept asking, what is this thing? And Plato took that further, said those definitions are pointing to real entities. But Aristotle, even though he was Plato's student, started going in a different direction.
He was way more grounded in what we can actually see and experience, right?
Much more.
So this brings us to phenomena. He put a lot of emphasis on appearances, what our senses tell us.
It's the starting point for investigation, a way to keep our theories honest, basically.
Because he thought our senses, our minds, they're not perfect, but they're generally reliable, right?
Yeah, they're structured to let us connect with the real world. So what we perceive, it gives us a good initial grasp on things. And it's a good check for our big philosophical ideas.
So unlike Plato, who sometimes seems to dismiss everyday experience,
Aristotle's taking it and building on it.
it's the foundation. Okay, so nuts and bolts time. Let's talk logic and science.
Let's do it.
So we said logic was his tool, the organon.
Right, crucial but not the end goal.
Exactly. So science, or epistemene in Greek, it wasn't just about making logically valid arguments.
Like those classic syllogisms, all men are mortal, Socrates is a man, therefore Socrates is mortal, that kind of thing.
Yeah, so logic's important, but Aristotle thought true scientific knowledge meant more than that. It meant organizing knowledge into arguments where the premises weren't just true, but necessarily true.
Premises that reveal the actual, real nature of things. Truths that are, as he put it, better known by nature.
And this is where we get into his essentialism, right?
Deeply essentialist. He had all these ways of talking about what makes something what it is. To TSD, to einai, ousia.
And the big one.
To tienai, what it was to be. That core essence. It's what makes a thing, a certain kind of thing, consistently over time.
Like the deep universal features that make something what it is.
Exactly.
So, for example, if we're trying to figure out what it means to be human, Aristotle's not interested in, superficial stuff, things that change, things that not all humans share.
He's going for the fundamental essence.
Like maybe rationality, right, which he thought all humans have and only humans have, and that explains so much of what we do.
Right on. And it's important to separate this Aristotelian essentialism from modal essentialism.
Modal essentialism being
the idea that if something loses a certain property, it stops existing.
Ah, okay.
So Aristotle, he had this idea of propria, properties that aren't the core essence, but they flow from it.
They're essential in that if you're human and therefore rational, you'll have the ability for language, for example.
But that ability for language, It's not the essence of rationality itself.
It's a consequence, not the core.
Exactly.
Makes sense. Now, language itself, Aristotle also spent a good chunk of time thinking about that. Ideas like univocity, non-univocity.
Homonomy, yeah. How the same word can have different meanings.
And he came up with this paraphrase test to help figure that out.
It's in his topics. Basically, if you can rephrase something in different ways, and those rephrased statements aren't really interchangeable, then the word probably has multiple meanings.
Like, that's a good dog versus that's a good try.
Good means different things in each sentence.
Right. So Aristotle used this idea of homony to tackle some seriously abstract stuff, especially the concept of being.
Oh yeah, and he actually argued against there being one big science of being, because he didn't think being was a single genus.
Wait, hold on. Why couldn't being be a genus for him? That seems a bit strange.
Well, for him, genus is all about categories and contrasts. If you've got a genus like animal, you automatically have non-animal.
Plants, rocks, all that.
Right. But with being, what's the opposite?
Non-being.
Yeah, and that doesn't really work as a comparable category. So, since he thought each science should focus on one genus...
No single genus for being means no overarching science of being.
Precisely.
But then what about core-dependent homonomy? If being isn't one thing, how do all these different ways we use the word being relate to each other?
That's where the core-dependent part comes in. He's saying the ways we use being are interconnected, even though it's not a simple single concept. It all goes back to his theory of categories. Substance, quality, quantity, all of those.
Remind me what those are again?
So you've got substance, which is like individual things. This microphone, you, a particular tree. Then quality, like being green. Quantity, like being 10 feet tall. Relation, like being taller than something else.
Okay, got it.
And for him, substance, those individual things, that's primary.
Makes sense.
All the other categories, they depend on a substance to exist. You know, a quality has to be a quality of something.
Right, a quality's got to be the quantity of something. So when we say a quality is a certain way, that being depends on the substance that is. So basically, substance is the core.
Foundation.
And all the other ways of being rely on it. That's why substance is such a big deal in his category.
Huge deal.
Okay, let's talk about something else he's famous for. Causation, and specifically teleology.
This is where it gets really interesting and sometimes tricky.
Yeah, this is the stuff that gets people saying, oh, Aristotle, he thought everything had a purpose. How quaint.
But it's more complicated than that. So in his metaphysics, he lays out his 4 causes. Material, formal, efficient, final.
Material cause being.
What something's made of. The bronze of a statue, for example.
Got it. Formal.
The shape, the structure. What makes it that specific kind of thing?
Efficient cause.
What brings it into being? The sculptor making the statue. And then there's the final cause.
The purpose.
That for the sake of which it exists. Maybe to honor a god or commemorate something.
And that's the one that people stumble on. They think he's saying everything's got some conscious intention behind it.
And that's just not it. Aristotle was very clear that final causes in nature, they're not about conscious intention.
So like an acorn becoming an oak tree.
That's its natural end, but it's not because the acorn's thinking, oh, I want to be a big tree someday.
Right, no tiny acorn dreams.
And it's not like some external agent is constantly intervening, making that happen.
Okay, so when we talk about the purpose of an eye being to see, we're not saying the eye has a goal in mind.
Nope.
Or that there's this divine being who's like, okay, your job is seeing.
Not at all. This is where that quote from Zeller comes in. He said, Aristotle's eleology, it's immanent in nature.
Immanent meaning.
It's built in, part of how things work. It's not about us. It's not about giving rocks feelings or anything like that.
But no rocks having existential crises.
No. There's this silly quote people attribute to B.F. Skinner about falling objects being jubilant because they're reaching their home.
That's hilarious.
But it completely misses the point.
So for Aristotle, it's more about the natural tendencies of things, how they develop and function based on what they are.
Exactly.
Okay, what about chance and spontaneity? He talks about those in his physics. How do those fit in? Because they seem random, right?
Well, he acknowledged that a lot of stuff seems to happen by chance. But he tried to figure out how those events fit into his system.
Rather than just saying, oh, well, pure randomness, that's it.
Right, so he distinguishes those from things that happen by necessity or things that usually happen a certain way.
And for him, chance is what happens when you're doing something for one reason, but something else happens as a side effect.
An unintended consequence.
Like you go to the store to buy groceries.
And you bump into an old friend.
That's chance. Your goal was shopping, but that meeting was a chance occurrence.
It came from your action, but it wasn't the intended result.
Okay, so chance events aren't uncaused. It's just that the outcome wasn't what you were aiming for, precisely. All right, let's move on to another big idea, substance and hylomorphism.
Core stuff here. This gets into how he understood reality itself.
So in his categories, he introduces this idea of primary substance individual, concrete things.
You meet this microphone, that oak tree over
The
there.
basic things that exist on their own and that have properties.
And then with hylomorphism, which is the idea that things are made of matter and form.
Hylomorphism, that's a mouthful.
It is, but it's basically saying that those individual things, they're not just simple individual units.
They're made up of stuff.
The matter, right, and the form.
So a specific person like Socrates.
He's got his physical stuff, his matter, and he's got his form, his essence, what makes him human.
Okay, so we've got the individual being like Socrates, we've got the matter, and we've got the form. Which one did Aristotle say was the primary substance?
Ah, good question. That's kept philosophers arguing for centuries.
Ha, good question, huh?
Not really. On the one hand, you've got the individual, like Socrates, seems like the primary thing, because that's what we experience directly.
Okay, Socrates is wise, not Socrates' matter is wise.
Right. But then matter, that's what sticks around even when the individual changes.
And it can take on different forms.
But by itself, matter is undefined. It's just potential. Form is what shapes it, what determines what kind of thing it is.
So form's got to be pretty fundamental, too.
Very fundamental. So Aristotle saw them as inseparable, but with form being key for defining what something is.
And for him, hylomorphism wasn't just some helpful way to think about things.
It was reality.
He thought matter and form were real out there in the world, not just concepts in our heads.
Real features of the world, yeah.
Okay, now let's connect all this to his ethics and politics, because he saw those as connected too, right?
Oh, totally. So just like everything in nature has a telos, a purpose.
He thought human life has one too.
And he thought the best way for us to live, it's not just a matter of opinion.
It's something objective, and it's tied to living in accordance with reason.
Right. People can choose to live differently. But he wanted to figure out what that best life, that true flourishing, really meant.
And this is where eudaimonia comes in, often translated as happiness, but maybe flourishing or living well is a better fit.
Yeah, happiness makes it sound a bit simplistic. And he had specific criteria for what this eudaimonia had to be.
Like what?
First, it had to be something we desire for its own sake, not just to get something else.
Okay, so not just a means to an end.
Right. Second, everything else we want, we should ultimately want it for the sake of eudaimonia.
So it's the ultimate goal.
Exactly. Third, it has to be complete, something that makes life worthwhile all by itself.
And finally,
self-sufficient, not depending on things outside of itself.
so based on all that, he concluded that just chasing pleasure or seeking honor, those couldn't be the ultimate good.
Exactly. Pleasure's often about getting something else. And a life focused on honor is too dependent on other people, their opinions.
Not self-sufficient. So to figure out what eudaimonia really is, he looked at what he called the human function.
Our ergon.
The human function. What does that even mean?
So he reasoned that, like any tool, a knife for cutting, a hammer for hammering, humans have a specific function too.
What makes us different from everything else?
And for him, that function was our rational capacity, both practical reasons for making decisions in everyday life and theoretical reason for thinking about big ideas, pursuing knowledge.
So eudaimonia is about using those rational abilities in the best way possible,
In accordance with arete.
which is often translated as virtue, right? But it's more than just being a good person.
Way more. It's about excellence in all areas. Moral virtues like courage and justice, but also intellectual virtues like wisdom and understanding.
So eudaimonia isn't just a feeling. It's about living a life of rational activity and doing it well.
It's active. It's ongoing.
And this all ties back to politics, right? Because at the end of his Nicomachean Ethics, he sets the stage for his political theory.
Yeah, for him, ethics and politics are completely intertwined. Ethical theory tells us what the good life is for the individual.
And political theory figures out the best ways to organize society so people can achieve that good life.
Makes sense.
And his view of the polis, the city-state, it was different from later ideas about individual rights and freedom, right?
Very different. For him, the polis wasn't just a government. It was the whole community.
And he wasn't suspicious of it like some later thinkers were.
He wasn't seeing it as a necessary evil or a threat,
He thought humans are political animals by nature.
meaning we're social creatures, and we can only really reach our potential in a well-functioning polis.
He thought the polis starts for survival, but the goal is living well, creating the conditions for human flourishing.
And he absolutely rejected the idea of a state of nature before politics, or that political life is just a contract for protection.
So the point of the polis is to actively help people be happy and live good lives.
That's the aim.
And he had strong opinions about which forms of government could do that best, right?
Definitely. He talked about correct forms, which aim at the common good, and deviant forms, which just benefit the rulers.
And for him, justice in the polis meant taking into account both equality, which the Democrats focused on, and wealth and contribution, which the oligarchs focused on.
It was about finding a balance.
But the ultimate goal was always human flourishing.
Always.
Wow, so his whole system, it all goes back to purpose and function, from the individual to society as a whole.
It's really a coherent vision.
Okay, let's shift gears for a bit. We also wanted to talk about Marcus Aurelius and Stoicism as a contrast to Aristotle.
Good contrast. So Aurelius lived centuries later, and he's known for his meditations.
What's the key difference in how they approach the good life?
It's about where they look for peace and fulfillment.
Okay.
Aristotle emphasized the polis, being active in the community. For him, that's crucial for flourishing.
But the Stoics, like Aurelius, they were all about inner resilience.
Finding peace within yourself, no matter what's happening outside.
So in meditation, as Aurelius talks about this power of going inward, finding serenity in your own soul, even if the world's a mess.
Yeah, he's in book 4 when he talks about that.
So Aristotle says participate, be involved.
Aurelius says find peace within, be self-sufficient.
Interesting.
And Aurelius also talks about how all rational beings are connected, how we should live in harmony with nature, act with purpose.
Even accept what fate throws at you.
Accept your lot, yeah. He's in book 4 and book 2 when he talks about that.
And he spends a lot of time reflecting on how short life is, how we should focus on our actions, on reason.
He's all over that in book 4 and book 2 as well.
He also sees death as a natural part of the universe.
In book 4 and book 2, again.
So they both care about virtue, about reason, but that Stoic emphasis on detachment, on self-reliance, that's really different from Aristotle's focus on the community.
Very different.
Okay, one more contrast. Plato's Allegory of the Cave.
Classic.
We talked about the theory of forms earlier.
But the allegory, it really paints a picture.
So in the Republic, and it's also discussed in that Parmenides excerpt and the TED transcript, you've got these prisoners.
Chained in a cave their whole life.
And they think the shadows on the wall, that's the real world.
Until one of them escapes.
Goes out into the sunlight, sees the real forms of things. The sun represents the form of the good.
It's a metaphor for how Plato saw the physical world, the world we perceive with our senses, as just a kind of illusion.
A bad copy of the perfect eternal forms.
Which exist in this separate realm you can only access with your mind.
And this has huge implications for how he understood knowledge and reality, right?
Huge. He's emphasizing this turning away from the sensory world, this intellectual climb, to reach true knowledge through reason.
Which is very different from Aristotle, who starts with careful observation.
With phenomena.
For Plato, knowledge comes from within, remembering the forms your soul supposedly knew before birth.
But for Aristotle, while reason's important, it works with the data from our senses.
So Plato's looking up at the ideal world.
Aristotle's focused on what's right here, right now, figuring it out through observation and logic.
Okay, last thing. To give some context for both of them, let's talk about the Presocratics.
The thinkers who came before Socrates. They set the stage.
So, as that crash course video explained, the Presocratics were the first in the West to really try to move away from myths and religion when explaining the world.
They started using reason, what they called natural philosophy.
Asking questions like, what is the fundamental stuff that everything's made of?
Big questions.
So you've got Thales saying everything comes from water, Pythagoras focusing on numbers, Democritus with his early atomic theory.
Lots of different ideas swirling around.
And importantly, they argued with each other, trying to prove their theories and poke holes in other people's theories.
Rational debate, it was key.
Even though it was early days, this focus on reason, on observation, it laid the groundwork for Plato and Aristotle.
It was a huge shift from explanations based on gods to explanations based on natural principles.
So, a crucial step in Western thought. Well, we've covered a lot today. Aristotle's life, his ideas about knowledge, logic, science, his essentialism, his views on language, his theory of causation, including teleology.
We talked about substance, hylomorphism, and his ethical and political theories, all about achieving eudaimonia.
We contrasted him with Plato, with the Stoics, and we put him in the context of the Presocratics.
That's quite the journey.
And through it all, the constant thread is his emphasis on phenomena, starting with what we observe and using that as the basis for our inquiries.
That grounded approach is what makes him so different from some of the others.
So, as you go from here, think about Aristotle's focus on purpose, on that telos, on the idea of a human function.
Does it resonate with how we think about meaning and fulfillment today?
Does his system for achieving eudaimonia in the polis have anything to say to us in our modern societies?
What appearances do we prioritize when we try to understand the world?
And could a more Aristotelian perspective challenge some of our basic assumptions?
Lots to chew on.
We hope this deep dive gave you a better understanding of this giant of Western thought.
Thanks for joining us.
Thanks for listening.